Eleanor stood beneath the flickering lights of the small animal shelter, her breath catching as she gazed into a pair of wide green eyes belonging to a timid grey tabby named Oliver. It had been 3 years since her husband passed, leaving rooms echoing with memories and silence sharp enough to cut. Every corner of her house seemed frozen in time, but the emptiness had become too heavy to carry alone. Oliver, with his soft rumble of purrs and gentle nudges against her trembling fingers, felt like the first warmth she'd let into her soul in years. Around her, the scent of clean straw and faint disinfectant mixed with the soft sounds of cages opening and closing. A young volunteer hovered nearby, clutching paperwork with hopeful eyes, as if she too sensed this moment might change everything. Eleanor imagined quiet evenings with Oliver curled beside her on the couch, the weight of grief easing in the soft rhythm of his breathing. She whispered secrets to him already, words she hadn't dared speak aloud to anyone else, afraid of how deep her loneliness ran. A slant of afternoon sunlight poured through the windows, painting Oliver's fur in streaks of gold and silver, as if blessing the possibility of a new beginning. But just as Eleanor reached for the pen to sign the adoption papers, the shelter door flew open and slammed against the wall with a violent crack. You won't believe how this story ends. It'll move even those with the hardest hearts to tears and prove that sometimes the law can't measure the weight of love. A man strode in, his charcoal suit crisp and immaculate, eyes scanning the room with laser-like focus as conversations died mid-sentence. His briefcase banged against his thigh with every step, broadcasting urgency and authority in equal measure. Shelter staff stiffened as he approached the front desk, his voice slicing through the quiet like glass shattering on tile. Eleanor instinctively held Oliver closer, as though she could shield him from whatever storm had just entered. The lawyer's expression was unreadable, a mask of professionalism that made Eleanor's skin prickle with foreboding. He demanded to speak with whoever was handling Oliver's adoption, his words clipped and cold enough to frost the air. Gasps rippled through the shelter as people exchanged stunned glances, eyes wide in disbelief at the unfolding drama. Eleanor's heartbeat pounded like a war drum in her chest, each thump echoing louder than the last. The lawyer waved a stack of papers, embossed with official seals, as though brandishing a weapon in a silent battle. And in that instant, the fragile hope Eleanor had dared to feel seemed poised to slip through her trembling fingers. Could you imagine being so close to a new beginning, only for a stranger to tear it all away with a single sentence? The lawyer declared, in tones that brokered no argument that Oliver was not available for adoption due to pending legal matters. Murmurs surged like a tide through the shelter, as if the very walls were struggling to comprehend what they'd heard. Helena blinked, trying to make sense of the words, each one falling like stones into a pool of confusion. A volunteer dropped her clipboard, the sharp clatter echoing through the stunned silence that followed. Oliver shifted in Eleanor's arms, his small body trembling as if he too felt the sudden chill in the air. The lawyer continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper as though revealing secrets not meant for casual ears. He said Oliver was part of an estate dispute, caught in the tangled web of a wealthy man's last will and testament. Gasps turned into frantic whispers, people craning their necks to hear every detail of the bizarre revelation. Eleanor clutched Oliver tighter, desperate to hold on to the fragile sense of connection she'd found in his trusting eyes. And as the lawyer closed the file in his hand, he stared directly at Eleanor, his eyes flickering with something she couldn't quite name. Why would a stranger know Eleanor's name? And what secret could tie her life to a cat she'd only just met? Eleanor's lips parted in disbelief, questions clawing at her throat, but no sound would come out. She tried to steady her breath, her mind spinning like a carousel stuck on high speed, unable to find solid ground. The lawyer softened his tone, saying there was more to the story than she could possibly know. He revealed that her late husband had once worked closely with the wealthy man who'd owned Oliver, forming a friendship Eleanor never knew existed. In the man's final days, he'd changed his will, stipulating that if anything happened to him, Oliver should go to Eleanor, along with a trust to care for him. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, a lump forming in her throat as the realization crashed over her like a tidal wave. Oliver wasn't just a stray cat needing a home. He was a final gift from the man she'd loved, a bridge between the past and a future she hadn't dared imagine. The shelter staff stood in stunned silence, caught between heartbreak and wonder at the revelation. Outside, clouds rolled in, dark and heavy, as if the sky itself was holding its breath for what would come next. And the lawyer, with a voice trembling now, told Eleanor that the court hearing would take place tomorrow, and everything could change depending on the judge's decision. Could you wait even one more day, knowing your future and your second chance at love hangs by a thread? Eleanor stepped out of the shelter into a world washed silver by rain, her fingers wrapped so tightly around the folder of legal documents that her knuckles turned white. The sky seemed low and heavy, pressing down on her shoulders as if urging her to surrender to the weight of it all. Each drop that struck her coat felt sharp and cold, mirroring the confusion that throbbed inside her chest. She moved almost on instinct, her feet carrying her toward her car, though her mind was still spinning in endless circles. Behind her, the glow of the shelter's lights blurred into the mist, fading like a dream she feared she'd wake from too soon. She thought of Oliver, of his trembling body and the way he'd nestled into her arms, as though he'd already chosen her. Could love really be tangled up in wills and courtrooms, measured by signatures instead of beating hearts? As Eleanor slid behind the wheel, the rain drummed on the windshield like an anxious pulse, urging her forward yet holding her in place. She stared at the documents on the seat beside her, names and dates blurring beneath her tears. And though exhaustion threatened to swallow her whole, she knew she had to fight, not just for Oliver, but for the life she still deserved. How could one small cat hold the power to rewrite the story of a woman's entire future? Back at home, Eleanor moved through silent rooms, her steps echoing off walls still lined with photographs of happier times. She paused by the mantel, fingers brushing across a framed photo of her husband, his eyes warm and laughing, frozen forever in a moment she could barely remember living. She whispered his name as though he might somehow answer, her voice trembling like a leaf in a storm. Could he have known all those years ago that his kindness toward an old man would one day reach across time to touch her lonely life? She wondered if somewhere, in the unseen spaces between worlds, he was still looking out for her. Yet doubt crept in like cold air under a door, whispering that none of this might work out as she hoped. Oliver's soft face haunted her thoughts, the image of him locked away in a shelter cage burning in her chest. She clutched the legal documents tighter, as if they might somehow shield her from heartbreak. Outside, wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and distant thunderstorms. And for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt as though she was standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to leap or retreat. Could you risk your heart again, knowing the price of loss might break you all over? As dawn crept in pale and uncertain, Eleanor forced herself into a simple routine: coffee brewing, toast burning, the sharp scent of citrus soap filling the kitchen. Everything felt surreal, like moving through a stage set, pretending life was normal while a battle raged beneath the surface. She kept glancing at the clock, counting down the hours until the hearing, afraid that time itself might betray her. Every tick seemed to echo in her skull, reminding her that one judge's decision would determine not just Oliver's fate, but hers. The lawyer had promised to call her with updates, his voice unexpectedly gentle as he'd assured her he'd do all he could. Yet Eleanor knew how fragile hope could be when faced with cold legal arguments and money-hungry relatives. She thought of Oliver's gentle purr, the softness of his fur, the way he'd gazed at her as though he'd been waiting his whole life. Her chest ached with longing and fear, because she couldn't bear the thought of him ending up with people who cared only for the money he represented. She kept replaying the lawyer's words, wondering if love could possibly triumph over such tangled complications. And as she stood at her window, watching the sunrise split the storm clouds apart, she made herself a silent promise that she would not give up. How do you walk away from a soul that already feels like home? Later that morning, Eleanor arrived at the courthouse, her shoes squeaking on the marble floor as she tried to steady her breath. People bustled around her, voices echoing off tall ceilings, papers rustling like wings in the hushed corridors. She clutched her purse close, feeling small and out of place amid the suited lawyers and stern-faced clerks. The lawyer found her by the courtroom door, his face drawn but kind, and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. He whispered that the family contesting the will would be there, ready to fight for Oliver, not for love, but for the fortune tied to his name. Eleanor swallowed hard, anger flaring that anyone could see Oliver as nothing more than a key to wealth. She wanted to shout that he was a living creature, a heart full of love, not an object to be auctioned to the highest bidder. But fear strangled her words as she followed the lawyer into the courtroom, her steps echoing like gunshots in the silent space. She looked around, searching for compassion in unfamiliar faces, trying to hold on to hope even as the walls seemed to close in. And then, as the judge entered and everyone rose to their feet, Eleanor saw a woman staring at her from across the room, a woman whose face she instantly recognized. Why would the wealthy man's niece, someone Eleanor had never met, look at her with eyes full of sorrow, and a secret only she seemed to know? The moment Eleanor met the woman's eyes, a jolt of recognition traveled through her, like an electric current sparking in a silent room. Though they'd never spoken, something about the tilt of the woman's chin, the sorrow clinging to her expression, felt achingly familiar. The woman, elegant in a dark green suit, sat beside another lawyer, clutching tissues as though they were a lifeline. Eleanor's breath quickened, questions blooming like wildflowers in the chaotic garden of her mind. Could this woman be the wealthy man's niece the lawyer had mentioned? And why did it feel as if there was a bridge connecting their lives, stretching back further than either of them could see? The judge called the courtroom to order, his voice deep and echoing off marble walls, demanding silence and respect. Eleanor tried to focus, but her gaze kept drifting to the woman, whose eyes shimmered with unshed tears. There was a story in that woman's face, one Eleanor sensed might change everything about why Oliver mattered so much, and as opening arguments began, Eleanor braced herself for truths she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. Isn't it strange how one glance from a stranger can make you feel as though your entire past is about to be rewritten? The lawyer representing the family stood up first, clearing his throat as he launched into a speech about fair division of assets. He spoke of numbers and bank accounts, trust funds, and the fiscal responsibilities tied to the estate. To him, Oliver seemed no different than a piece of antique furniture or a rare coin collection, just another asset to be distributed. Eleanor's stomach twisted in knots as she listened, fury and sorrow battling inside her like two storms colliding. Oliver, she thought, was a living being, a creature with feelings and memories, not some ticket to wealth. She glanced at the niece again, catching the tremble in the woman's hands as she dabbed at her eyes. Suddenly the niece rose to her feet, cutting her own lawyer off mid-sentence, voice quivering as she asked permission to speak. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, the judge raising a single brow as silence descended like a curtain falling on a stage. Eleanor leaned forward, heart hammering, desperate to hear what this woman had to say, because in the trembling edge of her voice, Eleanor sensed a secret waiting to burst free. Could one confession unravel an entire fight over a cat and reveal a truth that changes everything? The judge granted the woman permission to speak, his gavel tapping lightly as though encouraging honesty rather than punishment. The woman clasped her hands together, inhaling deeply as she stared down at the polished wood of the witness stand. Her voice cracked as she confessed that she didn't want Oliver for herself, that the inheritance meant nothing to her heart. Instead, she revealed that her uncle, the wealthy man who'd passed away, had often spoken about Eleanor during his final days. He'd described Eleanor as a woman full of kindness, whose husband had been his dear friend and caretaker in his last years. Tears spilled down the niece's cheeks as she explained that her uncle had made her promise that if anything happened to him, Oliver should find his way to Eleanor. The courtroom fell so silent, Eleanor could hear the soft hum of the overhead lights and the ticking of the judge's wristwatch. The niece sobbed as she said she'd fought her own family, trying to convince them to honor her uncle's wishes instead of chasing money. Eleanor pressed a shaking hand to her chest, stunned that a stranger had been fighting for her all along. And for the first time, she felt the warmth of something powerful and bright flickering in the darkness. Hope. Have you ever discovered that someone you didn't even know was quietly fighting for your happiness behind the scenes? The judge leaned forward, folding his hands, his expression unreadable as he considered the niece's heartfelt plea. He asked Eleanor if she wished to speak, and she rose slowly, her legs trembling like fragile branches in the wind. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she told the court about her late husband, about the emptiness that had swallowed her since his passing. She spoke of Oliver's soft fur, his gentle purrs, and how in one brief meeting he'd made her feel alive again. Tears spilled unchecked as she declared that Oliver wasn't just an inheritance. He was a lifeline she didn't know she needed. The judge listened in silence, nodding once as though weighing every word and every tear falling onto the courtroom floor. Eleanor felt her chest heaving as she finished, as if she'd poured out every secret wound she carried inside. She glanced at the niece, who offered a small, watery smile of solidarity that felt like a bridge between strangers. The judge cleared his throat and said he would announce his decision after a brief recess, leaving the room buzzing with tension. And as Eleanor sank back into her seat, the lawyer leaned over and whispered that someone unexpected had just entered the courthouse, someone who might have the final word on Oliver's fate, who could possibly hold the power to decide the future of a woman and a cat. And why were they coming now? The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open as a figure stepped inside, moving with measured, quiet grace that commanded instant attention. Eleanor turned in her seat, her breath catching as she saw an elderly man with snow-white hair and kind, weary eyes. He wore a simple dark suit, his steps a little unsteady, but there was dignity in every inch of his posture. People murmured as he approached the front of the courtroom, leaning slightly on a polished cane that clicked gently on the floor. Eleanor blinked, trying to place him, feeling the strange certainty that somehow he belonged to her story too. The judge motioned for silence, curiosity softening the stern lines of his face as he addressed the newcomer. The man cleared his throat and introduced himself as Thomas Bell, the lawyer and longtime friend of the wealthy man who'd owned Oliver. His voice carried a gentle warmth that seemed to hush the room's tension like a lullaby calming a frightened child. He said he had something crucial to add, something that could settle the dispute once and for all. And in the breathless hush that followed, Eleanor clasped her trembling hands together, praying for a miracle. Could a single truth from the past finally set two hearts free to find each other? Thomas Bell opened a small, leather-bound notebook, its edges worn soft by years of handling, and began to read aloud. He spoke of the wealthy man's final days, how he'd confided his deepest regrets and hopes for the people he'd leave behind. He revealed that the man had feared Eleanor might lose herself entirely in grief after her husband's death. He'd believed that Oliver, gentle, patient Oliver, could guide her back to light, reminding her of love's power to heal. In shaky handwriting, the wealthy man had written that whoever tried to prevent Eleanor from adopting Oliver was acting against his wishes and against love itself. Gasps rose like a tide around the courtroom as Thomas's voice broke, tears glistening in the corners of his eyes. He held up a notarized letter confirming the man's intentions and legal authority to allocate the trust fund accordingly. The judge leaned forward, his jaw set in quiet resolve as he accepted the letter from Thomas's trembling hands. Eleanor's heart thudded so loudly she wondered if everyone in the room could hear it, because in those words, she heard her late husband's love echoing back to her through time and through one small cat. Isn't it beautiful how love can leave footprints across the years, guiding us even when we feel utterly lost? The judge called the courtroom to order, his gavel falling with a sound that seemed to split the storm clouds outside. He declared that the court recognized the wealthy man's final wishes, ruling that Oliver rightfully belonged with Eleanor. A stunned silence reigned for one exquisite second, as if the entire world held its breath in reverence for love's victory. Then the niece let out a sob of relief and rushed forward, clasping Eleanor's hands and whispering how grateful she was that Oliver would be safe and cherished. Eleanor wept openly, her tears mingling with laughter as the weight on her chest lifted like morning fog dissolving in sunlight. The judge offered a rare smile and told Eleanor that love had triumphed over greed, that some things were indeed more valuable than any inheritance. People in the courtroom dabbed at their eyes, strangers connected by the sight of a woman reclaiming hope. Thomas Bell squeezed Eleanor's shoulder, his eyes shining as he murmured that her husband would be so proud. Outside, the rain finally stopped, and sunlight streamed through the high windows, painting the courtroom in gold. And in that golden glow, Eleanor felt as though her broken heart had finally begun to mend. Could you ever have imagined that one small cat could carry the weight of so much love and possibility? A week later, Eleanor stood in her living room, watching as Oliver explored his new home, tail flicking with cautious curiosity. Sunlight spilled across the floor, highlighting the silvery strands in Eleanor's hair as she knelt to offer him a treat. He approached slowly, then nudged his head against her palm, purring so deeply It seemed to vibrate through her very bones. She felt her chest tighten with an ache that was no longer pure grief, but something softer. Gratitude, perhaps, or the gentle bloom of new beginnings. Around her, the house felt warmer, as though laughter and memories were beginning to seep back into the empty spaces. The niece visited often, forging a new bond with Eleanor that neither woman had expected, united by love and a gentle grey tabby. Eleanor found herself smiling more, humming songs as she brewed coffee, leaving the windows open to let in the breeze. Sometimes, late at night, she'd speak softly to her husband's photograph, telling him about Oliver's antics and how he'd rescued her more than she'd ever rescued him. And as Oliver curled beside her on the couch, his tiny heart beating steady and true, Eleanor realized she'd found a way to love again, because sometimes the smallest creatures carry the greatest miracles and remind us that hope never truly dies. Isn't that the kind of miracle we're all searching for, even if we don't know it yet?